The night that drove us away. I had the most terrifying experience of my life, one that scared the hell out of both me and my sister. I work night and evening shifts, so I often return home late. One night, around 2 a.m., I was walking back when I passed a familiar spot near my house. A fenced-off area with just 2 trees. People whispered stories about it, saying many had ended their lives there. That night, as I walked by, I saw the shadow of someone sitting in one of the trees. But when I looked up, no one was there. A chill ran down my spine. Then, out of nowhere, I heard panting behind me. It started softly but grew louder, as if something or someone was getting closer. My body froze in terror for a second before I bolted straight home. A few days later, I was heading home again, this time with my elder sister after a late night party. As we approached that same tree, a piercing scream shattered the silence. It was a woman's voice. My sister, dressed in a tight party outfit, couldn't run, so we had no choice but to keep walking. But the fear was suffocating. We could feel something trailing us, its presence heavy in the air. Every step felt like a battle against the overwhelming sense of dread. We made it home, slammed the door shut, and locked ourselves in. But even then, the unease lingered. It felt like something had followed us inside. The very next day, we packed our bags and moved to a friend's place. Soon after, we left that house for good. Some places are better left behind. Weird story from years ago. This happened years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I don't even believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, and I'm sure there's a logical explanation for it somewhere. But to this day, it still freaks me out. So my stepdad worked out of town and was usually gone for the whole week. Whenever he was away, we had a little tradition. Each of us would take turns having a sleepover with my mom. It was my turn to stay in her bedroom, which, for some reason, had always unsettled everyone in the house. Seriously, if there was ever a haunted room, it was that one. I won't get into all the weird things that happened in there, but just know it was off. Strange noises, scratching and pounding at the door, flickering bathroom and closet lights, that kind of thing. Nobody ever wanted to be in there alone. That night, my mom stepped outside for a cigarette and asked if I wanted her to leave the light on until she got back. Of course, I said yes. So she left, and I was lying there, just trying not to think about how creepy the room was. A few minutes later, the light suddenly went out. Then I felt someone get into bed next to me. I assumed it was my mom, so I didn't even turn around. I just mumbled something dumb like, "Hey," or "Welcome back." She didn't respond, but she started rubbing my back. Her hands were freezing, but I figured that made sense. She had just been outside. At first, it was fine, but then the rubbing turned into scratching. At first, it was light, but soon, it started to hurt. It was rough, almost aggressive. I told her to stop. She didn't. I asked again, more firmly, and finally, the scratching eased into a normal back rub. A minute later, my mom walked into the room. "I thought you wanted the light on," she asked. I froze. "Wait, but you just came back a few minutes ago, right?" She looked at me, confused. "No, I just came inside." My stomach dropped. Slowly, I turned over to look at her. Really look at her. And she was only now getting into bed. I stared at her. "Are you sure?" She laughed. "Yeah, I literally just finished my cigarette." So, then who was in bed with me? And who had been scratching my back? Thinking maybe I had imagined the whole thing, I casually asked her to shine her phone's flashlight on my back, because it felt itchy. When she did, her expression changed. "Your back is all red," she said. "You've got scratch marks everywhere. Guess you're more flexible than I thought." She laughed. I didn't. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night, but every once in a while, I think about it and wonder, what the hell was that? The mushroom tunnels. My girlfriend and I decided to visit what's known as the most haunted town in Australia. Since we only lived an hour away, it felt like the perfect opportunity to check out the infamous mushroom tunnels, one of the biggest paranormal hotspots in the area. We arrived around 11 p.m., sneaking through a bend in the fence to get in. Ahead of us were 3 trails, but we had no idea which one led to the tunnels. We chose the first at random. Immediately, something felt off. I had been dying to visit this place for months. I should have been excited, but instead, this overwhelming unease settled over me, a kind of dread I had never felt before. On the way there, I had been reading my girlfriend's stories about the tunnels, sightings of shadow figures, unexplained lights, whispers in the dark. Some people even claimed to have seen satanic cults performing rituals deep inside. So, as we walked down that first trail, my nerves were already on edge, like something could jump out at any moment. And yet, despite the nearly full moon, we couldn't see a thing. Eventually, we reached the end of the trail, only to find nothing. Just an endless stretch of open fields. Frustrated, we checked social media and realized we had taken the wrong path. Trail 2 was the one that led to the tunnels. That meant walking all the way back. When we reached the 3 trails again, I immediately felt it. Trail 2 was wrong. The first trail had been dark, sure, but this was something else. It was pure blackness, as if the path itself swallowed light. Our phone flashlights barely cut through the void. Still, we pressed on. A large sign suddenly emerged from the darkness. The mushroom tunnels. I stopped. My gut screamed at me to turn back. For the first time all night, I considered leaving. I turned to my girlfriend. "Are you sure you want to do this?" She hesitated, but then I had a moment of clarity. I had waited for this. I was finally here. I had to at least take a look inside. So I turned back toward the tunnel, stepped closer, and then my girlfriend whispered, "That's the tunnel right there." I followed her gaze. I saw it, and I ran. I can't explain what I saw. My eyes registered something, but my brain refused to process it. All I knew in that instant was that I had to get the hell out of there. My girlfriend caught up to me, her face pale. Breathless, she swore she saw a figure standing in the middle of the tunnel, staring straight at us. I'll never know if that's what I saw too, but whatever it was, my body reacted before my mind could catch up. And that wasn't even the worst part. We sprinted back to the car, jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I went to connect my phone to Bluetooth when the most gut-wrenching, inhuman sound blasted from the speakers. I can't describe it. Low, distorted, wrong. My girlfriend immediately felt sick and begged me to turn it off, but I knew I had to capture it. I recorded as much as I could before finally shutting it down. I wish I could post it here, but this sub doesn't allow videos. If you're curious, DM me. I'll send you the clip. And that's the end of our story. But somehow, I don't think that place is done with us yet. A Thanksgiving haunting. This story was told to me by my roommate. It happened 3 years ago, during Thanksgiving in 2022. That year, my daughter's boyfriend invited us to spend the holiday with his family in Connecticut. Since space was limited, my daughters and I had to stay in the basement. The only people who lived in the house full-time, aside from my daughter's boyfriend, were his grandmother, his sister, and her husband. More relatives were supposed to be visiting, but since we had arrived late that night, I hadn't met any of them yet. The first night passed without incident, and soon it was Thanksgiving morning. I've always been an early riser, so by 7 a.m. I was already awake. As far as I could tell, I was the only one up in the house. I went upstairs to the kitchen, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat on one of the high chairs, just enjoying the quiet before the holiday chaos began. That's when I saw him. A little boy, no older than 5 or 6, padded down the stairs in his pajamas. He didn't say a word, just walked over to the fridge, grabbed something to drink, and headed back upstairs. I smiled at him, watching as he disappeared down the hall, thinking about how adorable he was. Hours passed, and soon the house was filled with family. Laughter and conversation echoed through the kitchen and living room as we celebrated Thanksgiving together. At one point, I casually asked, "Hey, where's the cute little boy I saw earlier this morning?" The room fell silent. Before I could process what was happening, the grandmother hurried over and pulled me aside. Her face was pale, her expression tense. In a hushed voice, she said, "Shh, be careful my daughter doesn't hear you." I frowned, confused. Her voice dropped lower. Her son died in front of this house a few years ago. He was hit by a car. I see him too sometimes, but nobody ever believes me. My heart sank. I replayed the morning in my head, the small footsteps on the stairs, the way he had silently moved through the kitchen. I hadn't imagined it. The rest of the evening felt off. The house didn't feel as warm anymore. There was an eerie heaviness in the air, one I couldn't shake, no matter how much I tried to distract myself. Then, later that night, something even stranger happened. My daughter and her boyfriend went upstairs to grab a snack from the fridge. She clearly remembered picking out a strawberry yogurt, realizing she had grabbed a banana yogurt by mistake and putting it back. But when they returned to the basement, their blood ran cold. Sitting neatly on the bed was the banana yogurt. Neither of them had taken it. An overwhelming unease settled over us after that. None of us could explain it, but we all felt it. Thankfully, we went home the next day, but even now, I can't forget those 2 unsettling days, and hopefully we won't have to go back anytime soon. A night in the Great Depression. My mother often told me a story from her childhood, an event so chilling that even decades later, she remembered it as if it had happened just yesterday. It was during the Great Depression, a time when money was scarce and danger lurked in unexpected places. My great-grandmother lived with my mother and the rest of the family in a small rural town where farmland stretched for miles and the railroad ran through the center. One day, my mother's aunt's boyfriend, a used car salesman, was in high spirits after making a big sale. Feeling generous and perhaps a little tipsy from celebrating, he handed my great-grandmother a $20 bill and told her to buy whatever she pleased. In those days, $20 was a fortune, easily the equivalent of $2,000 today. Excited, my great-grandmother decided to walk to the grocery store about a mile away to buy some special treats for the family. She took my mother's hand, and together they set off down the dirt road as the late afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon. When they arrived at the store, my mother noticed 2 rough-looking men loitering outside. They didn't seem to pay them any attention, so she thought little of it. Inside, they picked out a few items, simple luxuries that were hard to come by in those difficult times. But the moment my great-grandmother handed the clerk the $20 bill, something shifted. From the corner of her eye, she saw the 2 men peering through the store window. They weren't just looking, they were watching. And when the clerk handed back the change, their expressions sharpened with interest. My great-grandmother tensed, but remained calm. She took my mother's hand once more, and together they left the store, walking at a steady pace toward home. The sun had nearly set by now, and the road was growing dark. They had only walked a short distance when my great-grandmother suddenly froze. A rusted old pickup truck, its headlights off, was slowly rolling behind them. She didn't hesitate. Tightening her grip on my mother's hand, she whispered, "Come with me, quickly." Without another word, she pulled my mother off the road and into the towering stalks of a nearby cornfield. "Get down," she whispered urgently. "Stay as low as you can. Move quietly." Heart pounding, my mother obeyed. They crept deeper and deeper into the cornfield, the rustling of the dry stalks muffling their movements. Then, just as suddenly, my great-grandmother stopped. "Lie down," she breathed. "Don't make a sound." My mother flattened herself against the cool earth, barely daring to breathe. Then she heard it. The snap of corn stalks. The slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps. And then, a beam of light. A lantern or flashlight flickered through the stalks, the glow moving closer and closer as the men pushed their way through the field. They were searching for them. My mother clenched her fists, squeezing her eyes shut as the rustling of the corn stalks grew louder. The men were right there. Time stretched endlessly, each second an eternity. And then, silence. After what felt like hours to a terrified little girl, my great-grandmother finally whispered, "It's time to go." They rose cautiously and, without another look back, hurried the rest of the way home. Back then, the newspapers and radios were filled with stories of desperate people attacked, or even killed, for just a few dollars. My mother always believed that night could have ended very differently. Even years later, whenever she told this story, she would cross herself and shudder, haunted by the thought of what might have happened if those men had found them in that desolate cornfield. The scariest phone call I ever got. It was sometime between 12 and 1 p.m. when my phone started ringing. Just another scam call. Annoyed, I declined it. A few minutes later, another one. Declined again. By the time the third call came in, I'd had enough. Frustrated, I picked up, ready to go off on whoever kept spamming my number. But the second I said, "Hello?" I froze. Instead of a robotic voice or an automated message, I heard a woman crying. At first, I thought maybe it was a bad connection or someone messing around. But then I realized she sounded familiar. I couldn't place it, but something about her voice struck a deep, unsettling chord in me. Still confused, I asked, "Are you okay?" The sobbing continued, growing more frantic. Then, in a desperate, shaky voice, she finally spoke. "Pick me up." My stomach tightened. "Pick me up," she repeated, again and again, her voice thick with panic. I glanced at the number. Something about it looked oddly familiar, almost like it could be from a school. But that didn't make sense. I tried to reason with her. "Who are you?" She answered immediately, too quickly. "You know who I am. Please, pick me up." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know this woman. Did I? I tried to shake the feeling and told her, "I think you have the wrong number." Her response was instant. Desperate. "No, please, just pick me up." By now, I was completely unnerved. My gut told me to hang up, but something stopped me. What if she was in real danger? What if she had dialed the wrong number in an emergency? So I asked one more time, "Are you okay?" And then, silence. For what felt like minutes, she just sobbed. No words, no explanation, just pure, heartbreaking crying. And then, the call ended. I stared at my screen, the silence in my room suddenly feeling unbearable. My entire body was covered in goosebumps. Without thinking, I locked my door. Something about that call left me deeply unsettled, as if I had just brushed up against something I wasn't meant to. She never called back. No missed calls, no messages. And strangely enough, after that day, the scam calls stopped too. Since then, everything has been quiet, but I can't shake the paranoia. Who was she? What was she running from? And why did she sound like someone I knew? I think we met an angel. This story is a bit blurry since it happened over 35 years ago, but I'll do my best to recall the details. It was 1988, and I was just 5 years old. My family, my mother, father, brother, sister, and our aunt were on a road trip from Alabama to Orlando, Florida. The drive takes about 7 to 8 hours, and I remember we had been on the road for maybe 3 or 4 because my brother had asked my dad where we were, and he replied, "Halfway there." We decided to stop for a quick break, so my dad pulled into a gas station to refuel, while the rest of us headed into a 7-Eleven next door. As everyone got out of the car, my dad waited by the door for me. My aunt called out from a few feet away, saying she was taking my brother and sister to the restroom. That's when she appeared. An older woman stood right next to my dad. I don't remember every detail clearly, but I think she wore a yellow dress with a matching hat, adorned with some kind of flower. Her shoes were light pink and she had on sunglasses. My dad, startled, jumped back and blurted, "Shit, you scared me!" The woman didn't react. She simply turned to my mother and said in a calm but chilling voice, "She is going to die." My mom's face changed. Concerned, she asked, "What? Who is going to die?" The woman slowly turned her gaze toward me. She is going to die." My dad's expression darkened. He immediately snapped at her, telling her to get away from us and to stop harassing our family. Without another word, the woman simply turned and walked away, toward the parking lot. My mom was shaken, but my dad dismissed the encounter. "Just some nut job," he muttered. A few minutes later, my aunt, brother, and sister returned, confused as to why we hadn't bought any snacks. My dad made up some excuse, and we got back on the road. We never spoke about it again. After arriving in Orlando, we stayed with my cousins for 5 days. My mom, however, couldn't shake off what the woman had said. She had always been superstitious, a believer in God, the paranormal, and signs from beyond. Her worry grew into full-blown fear. So, she took me to a hospital. She told the doctor she just had a bad feeling and asked them to run some tests. Then came the news that sent chills down her spine. The doctor told her, "It's very good you brought your daughter in. We found 2 blood clots in her left leg." I didn't need surgery, but I was immediately put on blood thinners to dissolve the clots. The doctor told my mom that if we hadn't caught them early, they could have traveled and killed me. After a week in the hospital, I was discharged, and we finally began our drive back home. But my parents weren't done. On the way, they decided to stop at that same gas station. My mom needed to know who that woman was. They asked the station manager if they had security cameras. He said yes. Desperate, they begged to see the footage from that day. After some persistence, the manager agreed. My mom still gets a strange, faraway look in her eyes when she tells me this next part. The footage played. It showed our car pulling in. It showed my brother and sister rushing out with my aunt to the restroom. It showed my dad waiting by the door for me to get out. It showed my mother standing beside him. But it didn't show her. The woman wasn't there. There was no one standing next to my dad. There was no one in the footage when my parents were clearly seen talking to her. They were speaking to nothing. My mother is convinced we met an angel. That something, someone, was sent to warn us. My dad, ever the skeptic, chalked it up to a crazy coincidence and claimed the woman must have just been a glitch in the footage. But what are the odds that a strange woman predicted I was going to die? My mother listened to the warning, took me to the hospital, and saved my life. Coincidence or not, I don't think I'll ever truly know who or what we met that day. All I know is that if my mother hadn't listened, I wouldn't be here today.